Hello, my dear students. Welcome to biology class. So, we are continuing with chapter number 12, reproduction in plants. So, let's see what we are going to learn today. Today, we will be learning about pollination, fertilization, formation of fruits and seeds, and germination. So, let's proceed. Now, actually, we are doing currently the sexual reproduction in plants, isn't it? And in our last class, we had learned about the structure of flower, as because flower, it is the reproductive organ of a plant, right? So, what are the parts of a flower? Already we have learned. Now, today we will be learning about the first step of the sexual reproduction. That is what? That is pollination. Okay. Now, for the male gamete to be able to combine with the female gamete, it is necessary that first the pollen grains from the anther of a stamen of a flower should be carried to the stigma of pistil. Okay. So, what is pollination? The transfer of pollen grains from the anther of a stamen to the stigma of a pistil is called what? Is called pollination. Okay. And pollination, it can occur in two ways, that is self pollination and cross pollination. So at first you have to know what is self pollination. Now what is self pollination? When the pollen grains from the anther of a flower are transferred to the stigma of the same flower or another flower on the same plant is called what? Is called pollination. So here you see in the same flower, this is what? This is the anther, okay, and this is what? This is the stigma. So in the same flower you see the pollen grain are being transferred from anther to the stigma, and over here in a same plant the two flowers are there where the anther, the pollen from anther of one flower is being transferred to the stigma of another flower, but in a same plant. Okay, so this process is called what? This process is called self pollination, right? Next comes the cross-pollination. What is cross-pollination? When the pollen from the anther of a flower on one plant are transferred to the stigma of a flower on another plant, it is called what? It is called cross-pollination. Okay, cross-pollination is also termed as what? Xenogamy. Okay, so here you see from one flower it is being transferred to another flower. Okay, so this process is called cross-pollination. Okay. Now, this pollination, it is done by several agents. What are the agents of pollination? Number one is insect, number two wind, and number three is water. Okay. So, what is pollination by insect? Now, pollination, it is done by insects such as what? Such as bees, butterfly, ants, and other insects from the anther of a flower to the stigma of the same or different flower. So, how does it happen? Certain flowers have a nectary near the base which contains a sugary liquid called nectar. Okay, over here actually the nectar is present. Okay, it is a sugary liquid which is present inside the flower. Now what happens? When an insect sits onto the flower of a plant for sucking nectar, then what happens? The pollen grains from the anther of this flower stick to its body. Okay, like when it is sitting over here, then here you see it is sitting on to the anther. Okay, and these pollen grains, you all know that it is present in the sac of the anther. Okay, so it is getting attached to their legs or to their body. And when this insect sits on another flower to suck the nectar, then what happens? The pollen grains sticking to its body are transferred to the stigma of second flower. Okay. So in this way, what happens? The insect, they transfer pollen grain from the flower to carry out what? To carry out pollination. Okay. To carry out pollination. Here you see. The flower, it is sucking nectar from one flower, and when it sits on the another flower, then the pollen grain which are attached onto their body, it is being transferred into the second flower. Okay. Now, the insect pollinated flowers, they have actually large, bright color and scented petal as well as nectar to attract insect for pollination. Okay. They also have got large pollen grain which can stick to the body of the insect, right? The insect pollinated flowers have anthers and stigmas inside the flowers so that the insect can brush against them when it is drinking nectar. So what are the examples? Examples are sunflower, then marigold, bougainvillea, jasmine, banana, banyan, etc. Right? Next comes the pollination by wind. Okay. Now the blowing wind carries pollen grain from one flower to another flower and helps in pollination. Right. Now the wind pollinated flowers, they do not have large brightly colored and scented petals or nectar because they do not have to attract the insect. Okay. Now what is their special characteristic about the wind pollinated flower? The wind pollinated flower, they have anther, they hang outside the flower to catch the wind. Okay. They produce large amount of light small pollen grains which can blow in the wind. Now the wind pollinated flowers have also spreading and feathery stigmas to catch the airborne pollen grains. So what are the examples? Examples are grass, maize, rice, sugarcane, bamboo and palms. Next comes what? Next comes the pollination by water. Okay. Now the pollination in aquatic plant, okay, particularly those plants which are submerged in water, they are done by water. Okay. Now since the pollen grains are very light, they are easily carried by water from flower to flower for pollination. Okay. Now the pollination in aquatic plants such as Vallisneria and Hydrilla, it is carried out by what? It is carried out by water. Okay. So here you see what are the differences between self-pollination and cross-pollination. So self-pollination, when the pollen grains from a flower are carried to the stigma of the same flower or on the flower of the same plant, the phenomenon is called self-pollination. And what is cross-pollination? When the pollen grains from the flower are carried to the stigma of the flower on other plant, the phenomenon is called cross-pollination. Okay. In case of self-pollination, the flowers exhibiting self-pollination, sometimes they do not need any pollinating agent. And in case of cross-pollination, the flowers exhibiting cross-pollination, they need some pollinating agents. Then, from the genetical as well as quality point of view, self-pollination is less preferable. Whereas, in case of genetical as well as quality point of view, cross-pollination is better and more preferable than self-pollination. Now, the next important process, that is what? That is fertilization. Now, after pollination, what happens? The pollen grain, it falls onto the stigma of the flower, right? And the next step is fertilization, right? Now, the process in which the male gamete present in pollen grain fuses with the female gamete present in ovule to form a new cell called zygote is called what? Is called fertilization. So in other words, what we can say? We can say that the fusion of male and female gametes to form zygote is called fertilization. Now, how does this process of fertilization take place? Fertilization, it takes place as follows. What happens? When the pollen grain falls onto the stigma, here you see, just follow my cursor. When the pollen grains fall onto the stigma of the pistil, then the pollen grain, it forms a pollen tube. Here you see the pollen grain is forming a pollen tube downwards to the style through the female gamete in the ovary. Okay. Then this male gamete or male nucleus, okay, what happens? It moves through the pollen tube. Now what happens? The pollen tube, it enters inside the ovule. Okay, it enters inside the ovule. Then what happens? The tip of the pollen tube, it bursts open and the male gamete, that is male nuclei, okay, it comes out of the pollen tube. And in ovary, what happens? The male gamete of the pollen, it combines or fuses with the female gamete present in the ovule to form the fertilized egg cell. It forms the fertilized egg cell called zygote. Okay, actually the male gamete, it fuses with the nucleus of the female gamete or egg cell to form zygote. Here you see. Okay. Now, zygote slowly, by the process of cell division, it develops into embryo. Okay. What is embryo? Embryo is that part of a seed which develops into a new plant. Or in other word, we can say that an embryo is a kind of a baby plant in dormant or inactive state. Okay, here you can see the formation of pollen tube. Okay, and here the fertilization take place. How does the fertilization take place? Right? Next comes the formation of fruit and seed. Now what happens after fertilization? The ovule present in the ovary, it grows to form a seed. Okay, and the seed contains the embryo, that is a baby plant and food for developing new plant. Now there is a tough protective coating around the seed, which is called what? Which is called seed coat. Okay, so a seed is what? A seed is the sexual reproductive body of a plant which can be used to grow to more plants. Like spores, we have learned in case of fungus, spore is the asexual reproductive body, and seed is what? Seed is the sexual reproductive body. Okay, so actually what happens, all the ovules present in the ovary of a flower get fertilized by pollen grain and it grows to become seed. So thus ovary of a flower may give rise to number of seeds. Okay, now, after fertilization, what happens? The ovary of a flower, it develops and it becomes a fruit. Okay. And fruit is what? Fruit is actually the ripened ovary of a flower. The other parts of the flower, it dry up and it falls off. Okay. The other part, it dries up and it falls off. Only the ovary is left behind. So, at a place, on a plant where we had flower originally, now we are having what? Now we are having the fruit. Okay. A fruit, it protects the seed. Okay, like apple, oranges, mangoes, plums, lemons, tomatoes, pea pod, almond, peanuts, walnut, etc. They all are fruit. They all are having seeds inside them. Okay, here you see they all are having seeds inside them. Okay, some fruits are soft and fleshy and juicy, like you say apple, mango, pineapple, oranges, whereas some fruits are very hard and woody, such as almonds, walnut, etc. Okay. Now, next comes what? Next comes the germination of a seed. Okay. Now, seed is a sexual reproductive body of a plant. Now, how this seed, it germinates to produce a new plant. Okay. Now, the process in which the seed begins to grow is called germination. Okay. So, when a seed is sown in the moist soil, it begins to grow. And when a seed germinates, the seed coat splits. Okay, the seed coat, the tough outer covering. Okay, the seed coat, it splits. Tiny root grows downward. Here you see this tiny root is called radicle, and a shoot, it grows upward. That shoot is called plumule. Okay. Now, this produces a seedling of a plant. Now, this seedling, it further grows, okay, and ultimately forms a new plant. And after certain period, that plant, it bears flower. Then again, that flower, it produces what? It produces fruits and seeds. Okay, for example, you can say wheat, grains, gram, chana, okay, that maize, okay, peas, beans, etc. All these are seeds. Now, all these seeds can germinate when sown in the soil under suitable condition to produce what? To produce a new plant. Okay. So, this is how actually the sexual reproduction take place. Okay. First step is what? First step is the pollination. Second step is the fertilization. Third step is the formation of fruits and seed. And the last step is the germination of seed. Okay. So, in our next class, we will be learning in details about how there is dispersal of seeds and fruits. Okay. So, till then, thank you everyone. Stay home, stay safe.